Okay, picture this. You're just stepping out into the real world as a young adult, and you're hit with this intense warning. The shoot must take root and grow into strength, or sink into weakness and vice. I mean, talk about a high-stakes leap into adulthood, right? Today we are looking at exactly that kind of overwhelming pressure. We'll be diving into a dramatic 1890s survival guide called Searchlights on Health. Think of this explainer as an objective tour through how the late 19th century viewed the completely treacherous, almost terrifying journey of growing up. Welcome to our explainer on Searchlights on Health, the 1890s rulebook for life. We're going to unpack the really intense societal pressures of the era and explore what it meant to survive and hopefully thrive according to the incredibly strict moral compass of the time. Here is our roadmap for the journey today. We're going to start with the 1890s survival guide, then look at character, company, and control. From there, we explore the power of the home, shift over to expectations for young women, and finally, examine the high price of purity. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The 1890s Survival Guide. What's really fascinating here is how completely the authors intertwined physical well-being with strict morality. They firmly believed that treating your body poorly wasn't just a matter of, catching a bug or feeling under the weather. No, it was actually considered a physical sin. They argued that preserving your health is a strict duty, and that physical training literally demands morality. Purity of life, in their eyes, was the absolute safeguard of the young. So catching a cold or indulging a bad habit wasn't just a physical issue, it was a deep moral failing that could totally ruin future generations.
All right, moving on to Section 2, Character, Company, and Control.
Now we shift our focus to how Victorians viewed the immense, almost contagious danger of bad influences. The text sets up a very stark dichotomy. On one side, you've got the wise associate, estimable, virtuous, pure. On the other side, the foolish associate, profane, vulgar, debased. The authors lean heavily on the ancient maxim that a man is known by the company he keeps. They genuinely believed your character was highly infectious. If you walk with the lame, they warned, you will inevitably learn to limp. And they don't hold back on the grim warnings either. The guidebook's message is crystal clear. Mingle with the culpable, and you are guaranteed to, as the text explicitly puts it, die with the criminal. There was absolutely no gray area here. Bad company dragged you down permanently. End of story. Let's look at how they broke down the actual mechanics of habit forming, because it's super methodical. It always starts with an initial, vigorous resistance to vice. But then, there's a decreasing resistance over time, which finally leads to a total surrender to habit. The authors use this striking metaphor. They compare a bad habit to a nail driven into a post. You might be able to pull it out easily after just the first tap, right? But drive it all the way in, and you literally have to destroy the wood to remove it. That is exactly how permanent they viewed these moral missteps. To prevent that kind of destruction, the guidebook lays out some incredibly rigorous rules for self-discipline. You must resist instinctive impulse. You have to control your thoughts, your speech, and your acts. You need to practice self-denial even in the smallest things. They even urge the suppression of ill humor and sarcasm, which, fun fact, the poet Robert Burns apparently really struggled with. And, of course, they demand total abstinence from strong drink. This intense level of self-control is what they defined as the primary essence of character. To them, it's the very thing that separates humans from mere animals. Which brings us to Section 3, the power of the home. So where does all this vital self-control actually originate? According to the text, it begins at the absolute foundation of Victorian society, the home. The guidebook frames the home as the ultimate school of character. In fact, it claims that the tiniest bits of opinion sown in the nursery eventually become the public opinion of the world. It's inside those four walls that the seeds for an entire nation are planted and nourished. And the beating heart of that home? Maternal love. The authors define this as the visible providence of our race, a constant and universal influence beginning at the outstart of life. The book places just an extraordinary amount of weight on the mother's role. It warns that a young man who forsakes his mother's advice has essentially severed the last tie to an honorable and upright life. It is the ultimate anchor. Interestingly, the text outlines a very rigid division of emotional and intellectual labor. Men were categorized by brain, judgment, and strength. Women, on the other hand, were defined by heart, feeling, and attributes like grace, ornament, and solace. Basically, men directed the intellect, but women were expected to cultivate the feelings that ultimately determined a person's character.
Let's see how this builds as we move into Section 4, Expectations for Young Women.
Because of this perceived role as the emotional and moral center, the pressures placed on young women of the era were incredibly specific and honestly pretty intense. The book takes an astonishingly harsh stance on physical beauty. It actually labels beauty as dangerous, deceitful, weak, and shallow. They warn that in 9 cases out of 10, it makes girls silly, senseless, thoughtless, and vain. Instead, the book champions inward grace. That's defined as kindness and purity that remains unfading over time. Beauty, they argued, was just a trap. Grace was the true crown. The underlying expectation here was that a woman's true societal value was measured by her ability to act as a civilizer. The text literally states that boys are almost like savages, and it was a young woman's duty to tame their ferocity through her absolute gentle purity and kindness. Her morality was meant to be a shield for everyone around her, which leads to incredibly dramatic warnings like this one. We urge you, gentle maiden, to beware of the silken enticements of the stranger. The melodrama here is just palpable, right? The authors were deeply, deeply concerned about outside suitors and the deceitfulness of first love. They cautioned young women to heavily sound the deep fountains of their own hearts before irrevocably sealing their destinies. All right, let's wrap things up with Section 5, the high price of purity. All of these strict Victorian rules, the habits, the maternal guidance, the warnings to young women, they all culminated in one absolute goal: the complete preservation of a pristine reputation. The text asks us to consider the immense stakes here. What is the ultimate cost of a ruined reputation? According to the guidebook, losing your good name is a crime without a remedy. It turns the entire voyage of life into a joyless peril. Without a good reputation, they argue, gold has no value and beauty has no charm. So, to avoid this joyless peril, the boundaries of personal purity were drawn with absolute rigidity. You had to maintain absolute self-restraint, avoid corrupting books or pictures, shun vulgar theater scenes, abstain entirely from gambling and drunkenness, and above all, beware what they dramatically call the fatal maelstrom of gratification. Any temporary indulgence was viewed as a highly slippery slope that would swiftly drag a person toward disease and ultimately death. The guidebook's core assertion is that mankind is naturally careless. Falling into temptation wasn't just seen as a minor slip-up. It was viewed as a profound personal failure to maintain valiant self-discipline. The responsibility was entirely on the individual to stay vigilant every single second of the day. Which brings us to a compelling final thought. After exploring this intense 1890s rulebook, with its overwhelming fear of lost character and bad company, has the core pursuit of a good name really changed all that much today? Sure, we might not use terms like physical sin anymore, but when you compare these 130-year-old moral anxieties to our modern hustle culture, cancel culture, and the intense reputational pressures of the digital age, are we really so different? It's definitely something to reflect on. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.